Welcome back, everybody, to our second podcast. I'm here with Dr. Naveen Maliakkal, and we are here to talk about the carnivore diet on our podcast, Mind, Body, Soul, where we explore health topics from a Catholic perspective. So many people are struggling with health right now, so we are both passionate about getting information and just different perspectives on health to as many people as possible, especially Catholics who really want to be healthier. As a reminder, none of this is medical advice, of course. Before you make any drastic changes to your life, talk to your physicians and your doctors. And yeah, I'm here with Dr. Naveen Maliakkal. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, sir. How are you?
I am actually feeling amazing. I feel like something clicked in my life. Maybe it was my diet, maybe it's some supplements, but I feel great. Thank you. So today we're talking about the carnivore diet, which I believe you are on a carnivore diet, as I'm kind of on a modified carnivore diet as well. So let's start off with what is the carnivore diet?
So, a carnivore diet it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a form of a low carb diet in which you're only eating animal foods. Um, People are a little bit loose as to sometimes like what that is. So, for example, some people will say that you can be on a carnivore diet and drink coffee. Some people will say that honey can actually constitute part of a carnivore diet because it's from bees. But to be make it really simple, we'll keep it as a carnivore diet is a diet exclusively of animal products. And when we're talking animal products, we're talking the meat, fat, and eggs or ovum of those particular animals.
All right, excellent. So animal foods, meat, basically no plants. I'm sure some people make certain exceptions, maybe for fermented plants, but basically focusing on animal foods and meat.
Yeah, so when you start making exceptions for plants, like it depends. Like, some people will make exceptions for drinks and still call it carnivore, but when you're talking foods, then you're getting into what we call like, kind of like ketovore space or ketogenic diet space, depending on like the amount of grams. So ketovore is like I'm almost completely carnivore, and then but I have like maybe like a few things here or there, like maybe like 5 grams of carbs from like berries. And then you have people who are actually even not even low carb whatsoever, and they kind of eat animal based diets. So this is like like someone like Paul Saladino, or people who are more like meat heavy, but they're into like the Ray Peat school of energetics. These are people who will consume, fruit, honey, essentially, even whatever lowest toxin plants they can tolerate, and then they kind of tailor it to each kind of individual. But it's usually lots of fruit and honey for the most part.
Okay, awesome. And yeah, so there's a lot of popular doctors online talking about the carnivore diet. Paul Saladino is one of my favorites. I like to listen to him, and I was stunned a couple weeks ago. I was at a wedding, and I'm talking about the carnivore diet, and there were three other people. I mean, I only talked to like five or six people, and three of the other people there said they were trying to do a carnivore diet. And I was just amazed. So it seems to me like this diet is really growing in popularity and exploding in interest. So why do you think that is?
I think part of it is that things it's going to the reason that something like this would get popular, and we'll get to I think later like why it would be frowned upon by certain circles. But if something is going to be frowned upon by like people in authority, right, and it's going to catch popularity, it's usually because those people in authority are kind of failing on the job. So when we think about how modern medicine has failed, either with respect to its lifestyle recommendations or lack of, and has really just not been able to treat very many diseases well, or you get an answer like, hey, what's causing this, like what can I do, and the doctor's like, nothing, here's a pill. It kind of gets really demoralizing. So you can kind of go two ways. You can kind of have a fatalist kind of view of your health, or you can kind of take your own you invest in yourself and try to figure things out for yourself. One of the differences nowadays, say compared to like the 1970s when like Dr. Atkins released his book, right? Or you have a history of people trying these things. The reason the Salisbury steak was invented was really because John Salisbury, Dr. Salisbury, sorry, I should say, um, was using it as a form of treatment for autoimmune diseases, if I remember correctly, right? Like you could go back into the 1930s and see like ketogenic diets being used for migraines or ketogenic diets being used for epilepsy since like the 1910s or 1920s. The first diets for diabetes before type 1 diabetes, obviously, before insulin were ketogenic, very low carb diets that were heavily animal based. But without the internet, for example, you wouldn't be able to have access to that information or access to communities of people who've been trying this. Like if you bought Dr. Atkins' book in the 1970s and you were trying it and you weren't figuring it out for you, right? Tailoring it for your needs. Especially the adaptation phases, you might just give up, right? And just be like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not feeling well. This is probably a bunch of garbage. But nowadays, I mean, there's millions of people out there that you can talk to on various forums or Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or whatever. Well, X, sorry, X. Um, uh, and plenty of video content, um, and like Reddit, where like you can literally just ask. I mean, like World Carnivore Group on Facebook, you can you can search almost any question that someone has had on a carnivore diet and find people who can share their experiences. So it becomes a matter of one, mainstream medicine has just been so terrible that people rightfully are like, you're not helping me, so I'm gonna have to try to find a way to help myself. And the internet really has just allowed this um to allow people to connect in ways that they wouldn't been able to connect to, so that when you're trying to do this kind of major lifestyle, you have people who have actually done it before. Kudos to the people who did it in like the 80s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the 2000s, because you're kind of just doing this blind, and maybe you have a local community, like literally, face to face that you could interact with. But if you didn't, you were just trying to do it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, so being able to connect and see other people's journeys, and I would even say success. I think the people succeeding, you can see that much more easily with the internet. But
the other thing the other thing you can see is how people in the mainstream then respond to that success, right? So then that also drives, I think, some popularity. Is if someone gets better eating a carnivore diet, and like doctors or mainstream people on the internet, all they can focus on is you're going to die because you're eating only meat, but they're like kind of just ignoring, like, hey, I was supposed to be on like, infusion medications for this autoimmune condition and it got better, right? Or I was supposed to be, having gut pain all the time that like was only supposed to be treated with medications that may or may not be helpful. Or I had a mental health disorder that was, not really responding to medications, or I had epilepsy that wasn't responding to medications or whatever. And I'm better with this, right? When people just kind of ignore that completely, right? And they just focus on, oh, you're eating all this meat, you're going to die. It also kind of just makes people think like, what? Like you have to be really wed to the ideology to just ignore all those benefits in that individual, to then just hone in on, oh, you're going to die, even though you fixed the thing that I could not fix for you.
right, you would think that they'd be happy, but instead it seems like they kind of get angry about people getting well. So
Some do.
that kind of brings me to my next question. Maybe you'd like to elaborate on this some more. Why is the carnivore diet so controversial? What makes these people upset when they see other people eating only meat?
There's a few things. I think one is you have a an ideology kind of with respect to diet built on, for a lot of reasons, on the importance of reducing animal fats, reducing particularly red meat consumption, based on, I think, faulty data, but also this kind of notion that plants and fruits are necessary, for survival. Um, there are other things that I think would make people kind of angry about it. Now we won't get into like, if you're like a militant vegan, then obviously like you have your own problems. Um, you know, in terms of that, like if you're one of these people who are like animals have rights like people too or something like that, then I mean there's really no talking to that person. But you do have these kind of eco pagans, with respect to saying that like, oh, the real problem with meat is that these cows produce too much greenhouse gas or something like that, right? When it's like inconsequential, and to be honest, we won't even get into the whole is carbon dioxide what's killing us kind of a thing. but you'll see the hypocrisy of this where they're like, oh, we need to end all meat production, but we won't, like, deregulate nuclear energy, right? In order to stop using, or lower our reliance on fossil fuels. So how much of it is genuine, how much of it is not genuine, for like particular ideological things, it's going to vary from person to person. But some of it is just steeped in a lot of bad bad um recommendations that either had no grounding or had really bad grounding, with respect to the evidence, that have just become pervasive in society.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and just my perspective is it seems like most of the big guys are really pushing a plant-based diet. I mean, I hear that Harvard and most of these Ivy League schools are totally in with the plant-based stuff, and that's just what I've heard. I'm no expert. Maybe you agree with that.
Um, so the Harvard school absolutely is.
Yeah.
I mean, Loma Linda, you can get into Loma Linda, kind of their Adventist background and that kind of a thing, because they would be probably the most kind of pushing kind of a
Yeah.
plant-based kind of diet approach. Some of it comes down, I mean, like some of it even comes down to, and this is a little bit different incentive wise, is when you're constantly debasing the currency, right? The things that are going to become more expensive are the things that are harder to produce, and based on what's called a Cantillon effect, or Cantillon effect, um, named after an economist named Richard Cantillon. Um, Whoever gets the money first gets to spend it first, right? With old prices, and then as that money gets spent through, right, prices adjust. So the person who gets the money first wins out. So you don't want to be the guy at the end who never gets the money, right, as it propagates through the system, right, but sees the prices of everything go up. So in order to hide the inflation so that, these entities can continue their kind of usurious approaches to financing governments, and that gets into a long discussion about the legitimacy of a government that literally built itself on usury. Um, but that um, incentivizes the money printer or the people closest to the money printer to get people to buy things that are either one, more easily to mass produce, so you can increase the supply more quickly as you increase the supply of the money, which would hide the price inflation, for lack of a better term, or get them to substitute lower quality stuff, right? So there's if you ever Google like NPR Planet Money, eggs, and Lyndon B. Johnson, there is an anecdote from, I forgot, I can't remember whose book it was, but that Lyndon B. Johnson asked the Surgeon General to issue in order to get the price of eggs down, the Surgeon General ended up releasing a warning on eggs containing too much cholesterol, right? This was during inflation, money printing, I should say, not price inflation. Price inflation is a consequence of true inflation, which is monetary debasement and inflation in that regard. And that was during, the quote unquote Great Society with Medicare, Medicaid, and Medicare and Medicaid, but really it was just Vietnam, like the escalations in Vietnam and kind of winding down, kind of like essentially the Bretton Woods kind of roosters, coming home to roost, uh, from that perspective. So there's a lot in terms of, if we think about people who are like, of goodwill, right? I think it's because of essentially just a bad culture dietarily, where they were told essentially XYZ is healthy and it's not. Um, and then there are people who have, ulterior motives, right? And it benefits them. For example, if we're talking about the inflation picture, if I double the amount of money in circulation, ignoring the Cantillon effects, right? It's a lot more easy to mass produce, grain, right, or soy, because I can mow down a new field and just grow it. Whereas if I'm gonna, bring more grass-fed beef to market, I have to have a cow, get impregnated, have the calf, which will take 9 months, and then I have to raise that thing on grass until it's able to be slaughtered, which is usually like 2 years. So your ability to rapidly increase the supply to hide the effects of inflation for things like meat or eggs, is a lot more difficult than it is for, say, plants.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. I haven't thought about it in that way. So it's kind of like a way to hide inflation from the consumer, because if everyone was buying meat, we would see the prices going up
Oh
and
yeah, there'd be riots in the street. Like, I mean,
right.
if people were like, if people weren't willing to substitute, right, because of the health benefits of red meat versus like anything else, then people would be rioting in the streets, wondering why, ribeyes have probably I mean, depending on where you are, probably like doubled in price in the last 10 years or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we hear a lot of bad things about meat, but what kind of nutrients does meat contain?
So depending on like the type of meat, but let's say like the best types of meat, meat contains pretty much everything, almost everything the human body needs, pretty much. You know, um, it's also the better source of nutrients in terms of what's called bioavailability, which is that's a fancy term for how available is the nutrient in the thing for your body itself. So, for example, there are measures of protein digestibility. So when you read like split peas or chickpeas or whatever, some kind of plant food in the protein versus beef, it's not a one-to-one thing just because it says X amount of grams per protein per serving. Because the question is not how many grams of protein happen to be in the food in this packaged state. It's how much is your body able to absorb and use. So meat is imminently more digestible, and its proteins are imminently more digestible. It's also a complete set of amino acids. Now, I think peas also are a complete set of amino acids, possibly soy, but other forms of proteins are not, meaning that you have a certain number of amino acids that you can't make. And then you also have another set of amino acids that you do make, but you don't make that much of. Like you can get by, but it may not be optimal. So eating complete protein sources would be the most beneficial from just a protein perspective. If you're thinking about fat soluble vitamins, there or different ice like forms of vitamins. So for example, the form of vitamin A in meat is much more bioavailable, much more useful, right? There doesn't need to be a conversion step like the vitamin A in plants, right? When you have iron in meat, it is much more absorbable and potent in that regard in terms of improving iron stores than plants. Um, People will, you know, it kind of goes for everything, B vitamins, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are certain things that you just don't really find in plants. So there's a reason why, for example, vegans have to use like chlorella or like essentially a kind of algae that makes B2 in order to get, or sorry, not B2, sorry, B12, in order to get adequate stores of B12. Um, and there are enough people who have eaten a carnivore diet who have not died of scurvy, that vitamin C is not really that much of an issue. There's a great post by someone named Amber O'Hearn that I think is called, if I remember right, it was a long time ago, called C is for carnivore, as to why a carnivore doesn't need as much vitamin C. It goes, into various thoughts in terms of like one, like the amount of vitamin C you need on a very low inflammatory diet is probably a lot less. Two, without the significant amount of glucose, you don't have as much competition between glucose and vitamin C for actual uptake. So in a low glucose state, you absorb vitamin C instead of having it complete with glucose and then potentially not absorb it as well or not utilize it as well. And then lastly, you just meat probably has more vitamin C, especially the fresher the meat, than gets let on. And it's probably sufficient, for that kind of for it's probably sufficient for your needs. Whether it's optimal, I mean, people can agree and disagree on how much vitamin C you need, but yeah, it's there really isn't anything that you'd be too worried about outside of the transition phase if you went all meat, as to like you are just going to be you're guaranteed to be deficient in X, Y, and Z.
Right. I've heard that heart has a lot of vitamin C. So if you're eating your organs and you're eating toe to tail, you can get all those vitamins. And it sounds like you're
Nose,
saying,
yeah, and eating nose to tail. So if you were talking about vitamin C, I believe the adrenals would be the highest in vitamin C by far. Um, but I think it would be that. And the fresher the meat, obviously. So like that's the other thing. So like jerky, for example, because of the process of, it aging and then drying, is going to have um much less much less in terms of vitamin C than other things. Yeah.
so I
Than
think
other forms of meat, sorry.
no problem. I think we both really like meat and we both believe it's very nutritious. And it sounds like what you're saying is you can get all the nutrients that you need from meat. Would you agree with that, or what else would you need?
Yeah, I think you absolutely can. Um, you know, um and whether you need to go on a kind of like whether you need a ton of organs, whether you need slightly amount of organs is up for debate. But there's like most carnivore diets are gonna be able to, even if you're solely muscle meat like Sean Baker, like that guy does not look like he has any kind of vitamin deficiencies or is dying of scurvy. So it seems like, the proof is kind of in the pudding with respect to this. Because you don't see a bunch of carnivore, like every single carnivore have to supplement like crazy, various essential nutrients to live.
Right. And then one of my favorite topics and questions, and this is something that Paul Saladino talks about a lot, what kind of anti-nutrients are you going to be avoiding if you did cut out plant foods?
So there's a lot here. Don't mind the color change, folks. This is me. We might get into it. We might get into a discussion on this in a later podcast, but this is all about sleep hygiene. So this is me essentially downing tools because it is dark outside, and I do not plan on staying up until midnight and then having to go to mass tomorrow, like very sleepy. So the blue light filters have kicked in on my screens, which is why I look like I am in an infra like like some kind of like toaster oven or something like that.
That's awesome.
If I had them, I would put on my prescription strength like blue light blockers too. But my son took them somewhere, and it was cute. He was just like, I was like, Xavier, where are my blue light blockers? And he's like, I took them, but I don't know where they are. And I was like, oh, well, that's helpful. At least he's honest about that.
Yeah.
He's 3 years old. So but when we talk about uh anti-nutrients, um, so animals can run, they can jump, they can hide, they can claw, they can scratch, they can bite. So plants don't have that ability, really. Like even a Venus flytrap doesn't trap flies for the sake of defense, right? It can have they can have thorns, but most plants fight by chemical warfare. So they have toxins in them that animals either can or cannot detoxify. So, for example, right, there are certain things in chocolate that'll kill a dog, right? That's why you don't feed a dog chocolate. There's a certain amount of ricin in castor beans, if I remember correctly, that eating raw castor beans will be fatal to some people. Doesn't take much. So that's how plants kind of fight. And there are different types of anti-nutrients. So one of the more famous ones are things like oxalates. So if you ever follow Sally Norton, she is kind of the person who's written and done the most with respect to like publicizing the problems of oxalates, which are a plant toxin that tends to form various crystals in the body, can lead to things like gout, thyroid dysfunction, joint pain, a wide variety of symptoms. And they're prominent in things mainly mainly kind of like the your like the stems, leaves, and roots of things, or the nuts of things. So cinnamon, almonds, cocoa beans, various grains, nuts, spinach, kale, rhubarb. I believe like was it Liam Hemsworth, I think, was like downing crazy amounts of like kale smoothies and then developed like a massive kidney stone from that he needed to actually need surgery, I think, to treat for that reason. Um, then you have probably the next, or maybe even the most famous, would be something called lectins. So lectins include gluten. Lectins are compounds that plants use to defend themselves at a cellular level, and they are known to cause all sorts of interesting, kind of like immune reactions and can cause gut damage. Um, and probably your most famous person on like don't eat lectins would be Dr. Stephen Gundry, who wrote the book The Plant Paradox, kind of popularizing that notion. So you also have things like phytates, which are also found in mostly kind of grains, nuts, legumes, things like that. Um, and these actually bind to magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, and they actually prevent their absorption. Um, and in fact, anecdotally, or not anecdotally, in agriculture, there is an entire like industry of making phytase, which is the enzyme to break down phytate or phytic acid, in order to give that in animal feed, like for pigs or for what we call monogastric animals, because animals that are like ruminant animals with multiple stomachs actually have phytase in them because they have these fermentation chambers right? Filled with bacteria that kind of, digest that rumen down for them. Pigs don't have that. Chickens don't have that. So they end up giving these animals phytase in order to break that down so that they can absorb the nutrients from their feed even better. Um, you have, various types of, endocrine disruptors. Now, BPA and phthalates are pretty famous because not for food, right? For plastics. That's why you'll see no phthalate or no BPA kind of things with respect to plastics or synthetic clothing. Um, but you also have things like glucio glucuronate, things um, which are also various classes of goitrogens, and goitrogen is like what it sounds like. It's to cause a goiter, so it really messes with thyroid function. They can also mess with iodine metabolism. You have things like photosensitizers, um, which are polyphenols. And this is why, for example, people who work with celery in like an industrial kind of setting have to wear gloves, because you can actually get something called celery dermatitis. Um, and that there's a certain animal, I think a black-tailed swallow, that actually has enzymes to break down some of these polyphenols, called cur- cumarins, I believe. Um, so, we have a bunch of different things. And then cyanogenic glycosides, which, if it sounds like cyanide, that's because it is. These are actually plant compounds that poison the eater by releasing cyanide. So this is why, and it's most commonly in pit fruits, and actually the most popular cases are in yucca or cassava that's not properly prepared. So there are case reports of people, dying from severe poisoning from cassava. And that's actually one of the reasons why cyanide smells like almonds, is because almonds. That's what theoretically gives that's because almonds also contain a decent amount of this stuff.
Yeah, I think I heard Dr. Anthony Chaffee saying like 1 or 2 pounds of almonds will kill you if you eat them like all in one sitting.
Potentially like raw almonds, yeah, because like when some of these things go away with various methods. So going back to, like one of the things, like people, well, we've been eating plants for like forever. Like, why are they causing problems now? One of the reasons, and let's ignore pesticides, herbicides, all this kind of stuff. Let's ignore all of it. Um, People used to eat plants differently, and used to, both in terms of how they prepared them and how they had access to them. So, you know, back in the day, you only had food when it came, or plant food when it came in season and out of season, right? You could not spend 365 days of the year eating bananas in New York State, right? Like that couldn't happen, right? You could not eat, your weight in spinach every single day of the year, no matter where you were, right? But now you can. So if you had, things that came in and out of season with respect to, eating them, you would have a limitation on how much of any plant toxin you could accumulate over time. Other things are some plant toxins. So if we think about like nightshades and solanine, for example, right? The solanine in a tomato goes down precipitously as that tomato gets to full ripeness. So if you are in a situation where food can't travel long distances, the only time you're going to want to eat a tomato is when it's fully ripe and it's ready to be picked. But nowadays, because food comes from so far away for a lot of us, a lot of times things like tomatoes are picked early, right, when they're still green, and then brought over, right, in order to make the trip in the truck. Because if they were picked ripe, they'd come in like mush, or they'd be like mush once they got to the store. That means that they're not being picked ripe, which means that their plant toxin level is much higher than it would be otherwise. We've also bred these things, and not even talking about GMOs, but we've bred these things to kind of be more resistant and pick things that are more resistant to disease, fungus, like that kind of thing. But the mechanisms by which they're resistant are these toxins. So, for example, if you look at like the gluten, the digestibility of the gluten of modern wheat, and you compare it to something like einkorn, it is like night and day. And that's because of the gluten structure and the types of proteins that make it up. The gluten and the gliadin are very different, which can make it a lot harder to digest. And then you talk about what people used to do, with respect to, cooking things. So, for example, how many people are soaking their beans in tons of water with some apple cider vinegar or some kind of vinegar in it for 24 hours before they decide to bake them or to cook them, right? But that's a great way of reducing lectins, right? How many people when they bake bread, how many breads did you find in the store where it's been fermented in a sourdough type fashion for 48 hours before baking? Very few, you know. And but those all, fermentation, soaking, uses of vinegar with respect to those types of things, the peeling and de-seeding of various plants. So most of the toxins and a lot of things are in the peels, are in the outside, which makes sense if you're trying to block fungi or bacteria from coming in. Your toxin is going to be want to be on the outside to protect what's inside. You know, and those types of things were all like, people took the time to do those types of things, to de-seed, to peel, to remove the skins, to ferment, all these different types of, to soak, all these different types of means to make the plants more digestible. And nowadays we just don't do that. And we can talk about why that is, right? I would argue again, going back to inflation, when you have an when you debase the currency and you actually reduce people's wealth, right? In the long term, you incentivize live for the moment kind of a live for the moment kind of lifestyle. So you can actually destroy the morality of a nation by debasing the currency, purely by debasing the currency. You could have the most Catholic nation in the world, but if you debase the currency, you will most likely, due to original sin and its effects on time and on time preference as well, because you will destroy the morality. Because if you destroy the ability for someone to save for the future, they will not prioritize the future. They will prioritize the now, and that means they'll want things on demand, right? Instant gratification, short-term thinking, et cetera, because it's a sucker's game to save, right? So it's about going into debt, consumerism, living for consumption goods. Because if I buy buying something durable is so expensive, right? Like buying a home, right? More, you'd rather you can't afford it, so you rent, right? And then because you can't really feel like you can ever own anything without going into massive amounts of debt, you just start buying, like nice dinners or spending money on frivolous things. So that kind of overall time preference, like destruction of time preference, is actually probably the unraveling of a natural civilization. Hans Hermann Hoppe would argue that civilization is actually based on time preference. So the lower the time preference, or the more future looking, right? The less they discount the future for the present, right? The more civilized the people are generally.
Right.
Whereas you have people who, if they're like, I'm living for today, who knows if tomorrow is coming, right? Or if your money is being debased rapidly, it's literally like, I have to spend this money now because it's becoming less valuable by the second. I mean, that's what happens in hyperinflations, right? Like, by the time you get your paycheck and then you're off work, like you may have lost half your value, right, in your paycheck from the morning. So the only thing you can do is live now. And because you're poorer and poorer from the inflation, if you're naturally going to be poorer, the only needs that you're more and more only able um to provide for your most immediate needs, right? You have to be able to eat before. If you can't, if you're gonna starve today, why would you care about tomorrow, right? In the most basic kind of terms. So we can see that a lot of this kind of like high time preference behavior is at the core of, a lot of the health issues, I think, in our country.
Right. And I think it's also just I think that we are less moral and not as intelligent. I mean, you were talking about endocrine disruptors, and I was just learning about how many phytoestrogens are in plants and soy and flax, and all of that is going to, I believe, it lowers testosterone, having a bunch of those hormones floating around your system.
So would
And
inadequately eating cholesterol, right?
right,
Because
right,
or like inadequately eating saturated fat, because if your body's kind of in this undernourished state, so Americans overeat but are undernourished, for lack of a better term, right? So when you're undernourished in that regard, you're not going to be in the greatest state to actually make those kind of those kind of hormones. And we also, I mean, I don't think it's an interesting question, but like I actually do think from a natural morality perspective, I actually think that um, the external factors matter a little bit more. That doesn't mean that, like, I guess what I'm saying is you could fix the money and still have an immoral society. Absolutely. It could absolutely be the case. But I would go as far as to say is that it would be because of original sin, I think it would be darn near impossible to have a moral society while you're debasing the currency. Like you would only see as you debase the currency and go further in that debasement, you should only see the morality worsen over time. And that's what we have seen, right? If you chart the natural morality of the United States from 1913 to 2024, right? I think only you could only see decline. I mean, there's a rapid acceleration in the 60s probably, but you know, at given the rise of the problems of the church and the rise of the Vatican II religion and all that, I think we have an explanation, a parsimonious explanation for what happened in the 60s and post. But even leading to that, you see kind of a decay in society. Now that doesn't explain, like, that doesn't mean that inflation was at the core of necessarily like the Protestant revolt or those types of things, but it's one of those things where if it is present, you're kind of cooked until you fix that. But you can have societies in which there is no inflation and still have plenty of immorality for sure.
Sure, I think having strong men would prevent these people from getting away with debasing our currency as much as they are. And there have been, I believe, there have been animal studies showing that low testosterone creates apathy in animals. I think that's doing that to humans too. And I think all these estrogens and all these toxins is making us dumber and lazier and less driven to do what we really should be doing.
I think the one thing I'll say is a caveat to that is if you actually look in history and with respect to inflation and currency debasement or species suspension, and species suspension meaning that if you have fiduciary media, which means like paper tickets like with IOUs for like gold or whatever, right? Like you give the gold to your bank, they give you a bunch of IOUs, you can trade the paper kind of a thing. um that's been going on since ancient Greece. So it's not anything new. But the funny thing is that the arguments, right, to that the money printers use as always have always been the same, right? That inflation is caused by speculators, by hoarders, by foreign enemies, et cetera, et cetera. It's always the same kind of stuff. They always try to institute price controls. They always try to suspend, institute capital controls. The playbook has been the same for like 3,000 years, like going back to ancient Greece. So it would seem that the only difference nowadays is that we've never had a situation in which the entire world was on fiat currency, right? So there's no release valve, right? Otherwise these currencies kind of peak and fall. But at the same time, right? What's 150 years or 100 years, I should say, like a little bit over 100 years, right? In the grand scheme of history, like that's a tiny amount of time. In the span of America, it's like 1/3 of its existence, ish. Like right from that perspective, or sorry, like a little bit less than half, probably like 40-ish%. But if you think about societies like the societies that live in the Italian peninsula or something like that, like 100 years relative to 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years of history is relatively a drop in the bucket. So this is kind of a short, very anomalous period in history. But the principles are not the same, are not any different than the previous times this happened. The only difference being that it's just far more extreme.
Sure. And what I love about health compared, because I used to be really big into politics. I mean, I buy and sell gold and silver for a living, so I talk about, debasing the currency and inflation a lot. But what I love about health is it seems so practical and like you can implement it into your own life so easily. And that brings me into my next question. If someone's listening to this thinking, I want to be healthier, maybe I have some health problems, maybe my friend has a health problem, maybe I kind of want to give this a try. Do you have any practical tips for starting a carnivore diet?
So, one, if you have any medical conditions, please talk to your doctor. Um, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So, if you are someone who is trying to cure an autoimmune disease, right? Or if you're trying to get into ketosis and, or you're trying to fix a gut issue, right? Or you're just trying to get healthier, you're going to have different kind of, um, tips for you individually. So that's why, if for anybody who is interested in a doctor in that way, you should probably seek one out, especially if you have any medical conditions you want to fix. But some practical things, I mean, one of the things that like people really underdo with respect to going carnivore, if they do it, is they undereat fat. And you have to eat a lot of fat. Like probably more fat than you'd realize. Mainly because your body may not be the greatest at adjusting to an all fat approach, meaning that it's not the greatest at tapping into its adiposity or generating ketones. It's a little bit what we call metabolically inflexible, from switching from a carb based diet to a more fat based diet. So you actually need a ton of fat in order to not have those kind of, fatiguing elements. And also, and the easiest way to actually titrate your fat is actually to your bowel movements. So if you consume too much fat, fat goes to the colon, and the colon can only absorb water. So if any fat hits the colon, that's coming right out you. Like it's not staying in place. So, when people get, very, very loose stools and like feel like their food's going right through them on a carnivore diet, it's usually because they're eating too much fat, particularly too much liquid fat, or liquefied fat. Whereas people who get constipated on a carnivore diet, it's because they're not eating enough fat. And if that's it, it's really just one lever, just fat. So you kind of want to eat as much fat as you can. And tends to be harder for women than for men, probably from a cultural perspective, just trying to consume that much fat. But the issue there is women, especially women who are of childbirthing age, they need a ton of fat because they're like, if they start shutting down their fat, women will know sooner than men sometimes because they'll miss their periods, they'll have changes with respect to all that kind of stuff that will be more dramatic because they have higher needs for fat and cholesterol, particularly fat, I should say, because you can make a lot of cholesterol, you can synthesize a decent amount of cholesterol, but really they have a much higher need for fat than men.
Very interesting. So I believe fat is really good for your brain. I've heard it's really good for your oral hygiene. It sounds like what you're saying is it's really good for women, especially pregnant women. It sounds like fat is just really good all around, and I never knew that because I've heard people complain about their bowel movements on carnivore. So that's really interesting that that's probably due to them eating too much or not enough fat. So that's really cool. Um, so let's say someone wants to kind of experiment with a more carnivore diet but doesn't feel like going totally carnivore, what would be some foods that they should include in their diet? What should be some foods they should consider excluding from their diet?
So I think the main staple of a carnivore diet, in my opinion, should be ruminant meat. And ruminant meat are consists of meat from animals that have four-chambered stomachs, for lack of a better term, right? They have a rumen. So that we're talking, beef, goat, lamb, elk, deer, bison, caribou. If I guess you're in Canada, camel. I've had camel; it's delicious. Um, that's those that would be like the foundation, right? Um, we can talk about like how chicken and pork, especially because they're one stomach animals, or turkey, because they're one stomach animals, and because of all the corn and soy they get fed, or if they get fed a high PUFA diet, even if there is no corn and soy, that their fat content approaches that of canola oil with respect to a fat called linoleic acid that I'm not a huge fan of. So so this is a little bit different in the carnivore space. I'm not a big like I do not like I wouldn't eat tons of bacon. I wouldn't eat like tons of unless you can get low PUFA bacon. Um, I wouldn't eat tons
Would,
of
would,
chicken.
would that be
I would
grass
stick
fed? Is that like grass fed pork?
so pigs are a little bit different because pigs aren't ruminants. They can't really survive just purely on grass very well. So they do have to eat other things. Like pigs are foragers. So really pigs and like chickens, like those types of animals really live best in forests. Um, where they can kind of eat a variety of things. They're not pasture animals in the strict sense that like a sheep or a cow is. There are ways to feed pigs in a way that gives them low PUFA diets. Um, you could give them coconut, but it does make them very lean, so it ends up becoming expensive, right? That's the big thing. So, funny thing for anybody dealing with obesity, farmers know what the cause of obesity is because they utilize that all the time. Because when you want to fatten up an animal, you will feed it something sweet, you will feed it carbohydrates, but you will feed it that stuff in the setting of a higher fat, high polyunsaturated, particularly high linoleic acid diet. So you're not going to feed your pig or your chicken coconut in order to fatten it up. You're going to feed it sunflower oil or soybean oil or safflower oil, or canola oil or the meals, you know, related to it, along with, ample carbohydrates and, if you can, sugars and things like that. Um, so for most people, that gets to what to eliminate. And if you're going to eliminate things, probably in America, the best things to eliminate are any plant oils whatsoever. And I would with the rare exception being like coconut oil, mainly because from avocado oil and olive oil, even though they're not seed oils, the purity of those things in America is highly dubious unless you're spending a ton of money. Like real DOP grade level olive oil from like Italy usually runs you about $60 a liter. So if it's not $60 a liter, probably not real. Um, that's kind of my take on it. Whereas, butter and truly butter, like I remember my wife went to a restaurant once and she asked for like butter and they brought out parquet and the person thought that that was real butter.
Oh,
So you have a lot of issues with respect to that, but true, but like real butter, real beef fat, and that's the other thing is I would, again, I wouldn't. I'm not the biggest person of like saving bacon fat and things like that. I save a bunch of beef fat. So when I cook meat, beef or lamb or goat, now goat, lamb, and to some degree beef fat have a kind of distinct taste to them, which is why people like pig fat because it's a little bit more neutral for what they want to do. But I save those things to use as fats. If you're gonna avoid things again, the seed oils would probably be the first thing. And then depending on what your kind of goal is, if you want to be animal based, like if you want to be like animal based, like a Paul Saladino type, then it's not sugar that you would eliminate, but you'd eliminate quote unquote processed sugar. So really, your probably best bet would be like raw honey, right? In that perspective, because that would be the only sugar that's like truly just not going to be processed whatsoever. And the problem is there's a lot of fake raw honey. So there are brands that are truly, truly raw honey, and one of the I mean, it's not the great, like the most foolproof trick in the world, but if you have like a liquid that you're putting the honey in and it immediately dissolves, it is not honey. Like raw honey takes a lot of effort for anybody who's actually used it to actually get it to dissolve. Um, the other thing that you would want to eliminate, though, for the most part, is I would say any grains. So wheat, rice, corn, those types of things. And part of that is because of how they're grown in America, and part of that is because of when we talk about plant toxins, um, in America they're particularly bad. If you're in Europe, you may not have to be as extreme, right, in terms of eliminating things from your diet. But in America, with respect to glyphosate and the kind of the nature of American hybridized wheats and things like that, um, those are probably the three things to eliminate. So if you're going to start out and just be like, I want to eat healthier, I'd probably start swapping, non-ruminant meat for ruminant meat, and I would eliminate seed oils, grains, and any processed sugar, and just go from there. And then depending on what you're trying to do, right? What you're trying to accomplish, you may or may not need to, eliminate more plants from your diet, and it depends on what you're able to tolerate. So, for example, caffeine is another type of anti like it is a plant toxin. And one of the examples of its effects is decaffeinated coffee. If you leave it out for a while, it will grow mold much faster, or coffee beans than caffeinated coffee because caffeine serves as this kind of toxin. But my dad can drink coffee and in about an hour he'll fall asleep. I start drinking coffee, I get like 3 times a week headaches. I get like these weird jaw tightness issues. Not like a grinding, like I feel like my jaw is like kind of wired in a weird way where it's like I can't really open it as well. Um, and my sleep becomes much more fragmented. We can get into adenosine, caffeine, all that kind of stuff later. But some people just are not able to tolerate certain plants, and some people are. Some people are just fine. Like their livers and their guts can deal with it just fine. So it ends up becoming a matter of what can you tolerate if you want to tolerate it. If you don't want to tolerate it, there's an approach. It's like you can completely Lions diet it. Um, and another thing that you could add is I do think it matters like how naturally raised the animal is in terms of how well it, how nutritious it is for you, and sometimes it matters in terms of things like gut health. So, for example, there are some people who, when they have like IBS, right, or ulcerative colitis, they do tolerate truly grass-fed, grass-finished ruminant animals better than corn and soy. Whether there's some protein in the corn and soy that's making it into the meat of the animal that's causing that person a problem in their gut or in the milk, is an interesting question. But some people just do better when they eat a more naturally raised animal. So sometimes that might be something to that some people need to prioritize in order to feel better.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I mean, I love it. Get rid of the grains, get rid of the processed sugars, get rid of the seed oils. I really like that. Eat more beef, eat animals that are well taken care of. I think that's great. And then I kind of had like one more question. You were talking about, I think you were talking about not eating plants during the winter and being able to detox from plant foods. So maybe, if you don't mind, I could just ask you one more question. If someone wanted to go carnivore, but or maybe they were interested in it and they didn't want to do it their whole life, do you think it would be healthy for them to try doing carnivore for, let's say, a month or 2 months, or maybe even go carnivore for Advent? Would they be able to reap health benefits from doing like a temporary carnivore diet like that?
So it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? But when I have patients who I put on carnivore diets, like I don't tell them like this is going to be the rest of your life, you know, on like a carnivore diet or a lion's diet. I kind of view it more as a therapeutic thing, and then give it 3 months and then see how you feel. If you're like, my goodness, I have never felt this good before, I'm never going back, then you have your kind of answer, right? Like I'm someone who can eat the same thing every day for the rest of my life. I don't care, right? Um, Other people are not like that. They want some kind of variety, right? Some kind of gustatory, satisfaction. I guess beyond what some like beef or lamb or goat can provide. Um, and that's fine, But what you can do with that carnivore diet is you can kind it one of its benefits is being a pure elimination diet. You eliminate all this junk and you allow your gut to heal. And then what you can do is over time you can start bringing things back and see how you feel. And a lot of times people end up becoming more sensitive to the things that are bad for them. Um, and therefore they're more able to target like, oh, like I was dealing with like chronic abdominal pain. I fixed it with, my grass-fed, grass-finished Lions diet. And now like, I bring back wheat and I'm like, oh, I'm dying. Or I try like, erythritol, right? In like some kind of keto, kind of approach. Right? Like, I can eat cream cheese just fine and eggs and all that kind of stuff, right? Vanilla, I have no problems with. But when I put erythritol in a cheesecake, my gut's like terrible, right? Um, it allows you to more clearly determine what your gut can and cannot handle. And that can be a moving target though. So maybe in 3 years or in 3 months time you can't tolerate it. Maybe in 6 months you can tolerate it better. A year you can tolerate it better. You don't know. But by having that base established, you at least know. You can be honest with yourself, I guess, in a way too. You can say like, I know what it feels like to feel good, and
Yeah.
now I know what it feels like to feel bad. As opposed to constantly feeling like garbage every day and just assuming like this is just how life is. Like this is just how God meant us to be, to kind of just feel like mediocre to garbage every single day.
Yeah, and I can relate to that so much. I mean, I had a lot of issues, and you said some people try the carnivore diet, they feel amazing, they never want to go back. That's kind of how I'm feeling right now. And you also said something that I found really interesting that I can also relate to, how you become more sensitive. I've been eating almost all animal foods, and a couple weeks ago I had some broccoli and cauliflower, and I think those are very high fiber foods, and I got really constipated the next day. So I think I have kind of gotten sensitive to maybe some of the things that were causing me issues, but I mean, I'm feeling great just eating animal food, so that's kind of what I think I'm going to stick with for a while.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those things where I mean, it's kind of surprising. Sometimes people will be like, they'll have this kind of fatalism about their lifestyle, and maybe that's an excuse. You never know, like just to not want to change because if it's out of my control, then I don't have to change. But then if they do, and they realize it, then it's just like, oh, it kind of opens up their world to like, oh, um, like it getting back to one of the original questions, like why is it gaining popularity? Yeah, when we have a time in which the authorities are supposed authorities, whether it be the supposed authorities of the Vatican II religion or the authorities in mainstream medicine or whatever, have essentially led people so wildly astray. When people like figure out like the emperor has no clothes, for whatever through whatever means they figure this out, then it becomes like a complete revelation. Like what else is just wrong from these people like that I thought was true from these particular sources that I have to reassess. It can really open up your eyes from that perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you're right. There are things that are probably affecting people that they don't even realize. And if, they took a more proactive approach, maybe tried carnivore, I think they might look back and think, I'm really glad I did that. Maybe I wish I would have done it sooner. And I think some things you might not even notice are bothering you might go away potentially. Um, did you want to make any more comments on this discussion, or do we want to jump into audience questions?
And we can go into some audience questions. I think that sounds cool.
Okay, great. So, while we're talking about audience questions, let me go ahead and comment before I forget. Please, anyone who's watching, comment down below a question you have for Dr. Naveen Maliakkal, and we will hopefully get to that question on our next podcast. Today, we have a couple of questions. The first one: why do you think our Lord specifically chose bread as the food for the holy sacrifice of the Mass?
So we talk about our Lord in the person of Jesus Christ himself. So Jesus Christ has a beginning, right? The person of Jesus Christ has a beginning, right? Then, at the at the Annunciation, um, he chose bread most likely because it was one of the sacrifices of the the Jewish religion, the true Jewish religion that actually looked forward to the coming of Christ, right? The offerings of wine and bread. We can also talk about manna from heaven, right? That God gave the Jews bread from heaven, but this is actually heavenly bread, right? And you see this in a lot of our Lord's kind of discourse, that kind of like the basic tenets of nutrition back then was bread, because it was easily accessible, and that bread can sustain the body, but it cannot sustain the soul. So it kind of fits that he took bread in that sense, and transubstantiates it through the priest into his body, blood, soul, and divinity, right? As a sustenance, not for earthly or material ends, but for supernatural ends and for the soul. If we're talking about why God throughout all of history may have done this, I mean, he could have picked anything. The world that he created, just based on the natural world he created, things like bread, particularly flour, like the building blocks for it, flour, water, salt, and because there's no leaven, unless I guess you're in the east, um, and things like wine. They're very easy to transport. They're very easy to store, and they're very easy to have. They're much easier to have an ample of supply of at any moment. So, for example, if let's if our Lord took a lamb and said that you needed to sacrifice a lamb, and I will transubstantiate the lamb into the paschal lamb of my flesh and my blood and my soul and my divinity, right? Um, then you'd have to have a lamb available at all times in all these parts of the world. And this is before refrigeration, before freezing, or anything like that. Like, if you're going to eat an animal, you slaughter it right then and there, right? Wheat can be stored, wine can be stored, right? And it can be transported much more easily. So if we are to think of in a way, it was merciful for our Lord because he could have asked us to do anything, but he picked things that were probably very easy, essentially very easy for us to procure in order to turn them into something of infinite value, which is, to be honest, we're fortunate in that regard that God did that is that way because of his love for us, right? Because he wants us to partake in the Eucharist, and he wants that sacrifice to be able to be performed as readily as possible to appease God the Father, right? The unbloody sacrifice of Calvary, the continuation of it, and to be continued in as many places and as many times as possible. Um, so yes, I think that's mostly out of the love of our Lord that he instituted the sacrament in that way.
And yeah, I totally agree. And as you were talking, I kind of just thought about the fact, I thought about this before, but our Lord also used wine. And I don't see anyone out there arguing because Jesus used wine as his blood, you can drink as much wine as you want. It must be really good for you at any amount. I think both bread and wine, I think everyone, most people will agree that you got to take them in moderation. You don't want to just stuff yourself full of bread or wine.
Absolutely.
So question number two is kind of a two-part question. I'll just ask both of them, and you can answer them as you see fit. What evidence makes this diet a good alignment with Catholicism? And can we glean anything from sacred scripture specifically that provides information about what God might want us to know about food?
So with respect to things of religion, so things of God, we have to kind of also step back and realize that the salvation of your soul is paramount. So we're talking about health purely in this episode, mostly on a natural level, right? What is the thing that will make the body, the person function the best with respect to kind of their nutrition? That doesn't speak to the soul necessarily, right? It can in some regards, right? If you're better fed, if you're able to make, if you're not hungry all the time and irritable and things like that, you're probably less likely to commit certain sins like lashing out against someone or, something of that nature. Um, but there isn't, to my knowledge, there's nothing in sacred scripture that would say that you need to eat a carnivore diet. That God made us in a way that we should be able to tolerate that we are able to tolerate various foods. And again, that's quite beneficial because until modernity with refrigeration and freezing and stuff like that, I mean, again, the human race would have been subject to quite a bit of starvation if, especially after the death of like woolly mammoths and megafauna that were crazy, fatty, and humongous. You wouldn't have if you could only eat meat, then you'd probably have the human race have some massive drops in population as meat supplies fell apart. That doesn't mean that like you had consequences when people went more grain based. It seems like populations increase, but like people's height and their health and things like that seem to have deteriorated over time. But you're able to support life, which is pretty important. So that flexibility seems to be present with respect to that. And again, not everybody needs a carnivore diet, but again, we're talking about a modern food milieu in which none of the almost all the rules of or all the things that were present that were moderating in and of themselves, like seasonality, um, you know, the accessibility of things, how things have grown, they're all kind of like out the door, right from our perspective in terms of what modern food is like compared to, like I said, it's most like, I mean, I would be guessing, but I would guess in the time of our Lord on Earth that like an einkorn type grain was probably what was being made into bread, and not anything like the American hybridized wheat before we get into glyphosate and things like that. Um, However, we can get some idea of, I guess, meat's benefits from how the church treats meat, not necessarily in sacred scripture, but in sacred tradition. Because what is abstained from, right, on days of abstinence, like this Thursday, right, on All Hallows Eve, it is meat, right, flesh meat, and before it would also include, well, it still includes the fats, and it would also include back then dairy and eggs, which I believe I don't remember when those were loosened up on dairy and eggs. I can't tell you that, but those were deemed essentially the most nutritious foods, one and the most palatable foods. So, if you're if and Thomas Aquinas talks about this in the Summa. Let me bring this up. So if we go to the second part of the second part, um, question 147, and you scroll down to Article 8, whether it is fitting that those who fast should be bidden to abstain from flesh meat, eggs, and milk foods. Um, so, uh, whoops, there we go. Um, he says explicitly in there, um, but it is chiefly the use of flesh meat which is the most productive of nourishment that conduces to the production of humor. And in that section, he's essentially saying that, vegetables, wine, things like that, they can provide, like wine can provide heat, conduce the body to heat, kind of alcohol, like loosening up the spirit in a kind of sense, right? And then foods like vegetables can seemingly cooperate in the production of the vital spirit, essentially nourishing the body, right? From that perspective, but they're kind of short lived. Whereas the use of flesh meat is the most productive nourishment, right? It provides the most complete kind of nutrition and longest lasting. So, what in that case, the removal of that in the form of abstinence is a greater mortification of the flesh. And that's where we get into priorities, right? The priorities of the church are primarily the salvation of souls. So if you are so focused on your health and eating healthy, right, and being as healthy as possible that you forsake the health of your soul, right? Then what good is it, right? So you see this, right? Like bodybuilders take a lot of care in terms of, especially more natural bodybuilders, right? In terms of their diets and their exercise and all these things that we deem healthy. But how many of them are doing it out of a sake of vanity, right? Right, and that in and of itself not particularly useful, right, for salvation. You can be really, really healthy, but if you're doing it for vain reasons, then it's not meritorious at all, right? In fact, it can be an impediment in that regard to your salvation. So when the church looks to, abstain or looks to the abstinence, it is taking away the most nourishing things to remind us that the body is not the only thing that matters, that the soul matters more importantly than the body, and that the salvation of the soul is more important than the glorification or the optimization of the body. So I would say that the church, in its infinite wisdom, understands the value of meat nutritionally, and that is why its practices, with respect to its religious devotions, or in terms of fasting and abstinence, in terms of abstinence in particular, are how they have been, since the church was formed.
All right. Thank you so much for being here, doctor. And if you wouldn't mind just letting everyone know once more where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me. I have a website, lowcarbdpc.com. You can email me at floridalowcarbdpc@protonmail.com. And you can also contact the practice's phone number, which is 904-478-9669, if you would like to get in contact with me. Thank you much. Thank you very much, Mr. Drake, for letting me on your podcast. It's an absolute pleasure.
Of course. Thank you for being here again. I hope we can do this again soon. Take care.
Mr. Hilliard. I'm looking at your name on the thing. I got confused there.
That's
Mr.
no problem.
Hilliard. My apologies.
No problem. All right. Take care, everybody.